Converging. Good evening, Kalisperasas. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to tonight's book launch, which we included as part of the seminar series. The book we're launching today is Armenian, Greek and Assyrian Genocide Recognition in the 21st Century, Memory, Identity and Cooperation, by local historian Dr. Themistocles Kritikakos. And we thank Mary Tsaganas in memory of her mother Olympia and her ancestors from Asia Minor, and also encourage you all to become sponsors of a seminar of your choice during the course of the year. We still have a few unallotted seminars. Just some housekeeping items. We have a seminar this Thursday. Thursday's a normal day. Some guy called Nick Dallas is speaking on the Greeks of Tashkent. He is not bad, so give him a try. After Thursday, we have about a 1 month break. This mezzanine also becomes one of the venues of the comedy festival as well. And then on the 16th of April, we return, because it's still being used by the community festival, with an online seminar by Professor Michalis Bakoyannis from Aristotelio University in Thessaloniki, who will be speaking on the poetry of Kariotaki. And then the 30th of April, I believe, we're back at the mezzanine face-to-face. So it's a pattern that we follow sort of every year. While the Armenian genocide has been recognised by an increasing number of states, the Greek and Assyrian genocides have been overlooked. And many people probably don't even quite know who the Assyrians are as well. How have the attempts of campaigners of these three genocides, how has this played out in Australia? The author has carried out a comparative analysis of these efforts, which were done mainly by oral history testimonies of descendants of the survivors. The presentation today will be in a discussion format, interview discussion format, where we'll see Dr. Themis Kritikakos being interviewed by his former supervisor, Professor Joy Demusi. And I'm just going to say a few words about our participants before we begin. Let's start with Professor Demusi, Melbourne Board award-winning historian Joy Demusi is the Dean of Arts, Professor and Director of the Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences at ACU, the Australian Catholic University. She was Professor of History in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne for most of her career, and she still retains a fractional appointment there, as far as I know. She was the President of the Australian Academy of Humanities from 2017 to 2020. Her publications awards are just too many to mention, and I'll only mention a couple. Joy's book, Freud in the Antipodes, A Cultural History of Psychoanalysis in Australia, in 2005 by University of New South Wales Press, was awarded the Ernst Scott Prize for the most distinguished contribution to the history of Australia in 2006. In 2022, she was made a member of the Order of Australia in recognition of her significant services to social sciences and the humanities, to history and to tertiary education. I hope all this is correct because it's from Wikipedia. That's all true, isn't it, Joy?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, let's get to Themi or Themistocles. Australian Melbourne-born Themi is a Brunswick boy. Well, what else can he really be with a surname like Kritikakos? So Spartan heritage on his paternal side. That's where he grew up, attending Brunswick North Primary School and later on St. John's College. Although on his mother's side he's Kazi from Castellorizo, it was his maternal grandparents that hailed from Asia Minor, and no doubt that this may have some influence in his evolving interest in genocide studies. He completed an honours degree in philosophy at the University of Melbourne before undertaking a PhD at the university, specialising in genocide and memory studies under the supervision of Joy Demusi. On behalf of the Greek community of Melbourne, its President Bill Papagiatis, the Board of Management and the Education Committee, we'd like to sort of personally congratulate Themi on his publication. It's always a milestone in any researcher's career to publish their first academic monograph, and I hope this will be the first of many. Καλορίζικο και σανότερα Themi. Big round of applause.
I too would like to acknowledge we are here meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. So welcome everyone to the launch. As Nick said, my name is Joy DeMusi. I'm wearing several hats at the moment, but the most important hat I have worn to date for this occasion is that I was Themi's PhD supervisor for his PhD at the University of Melbourne, on which this magnificent book is based. It was a great privilege and a great pleasure to supervise Themi. He was a very diligent student, but he brought to this topic great insight and a sort of analysis and analytic rigour that really makes this a path-breaking book. So from that point of view, it is always a pleasure to see your student thrive, but particularly Themi in terms of the contribution he's made to scholarship. You only write your first book once, and so this is, as Nick said, a very special event to celebrate Themi's first book. It's a great milestone and significant achievement to do so. It announces Themi as a new scholar in the field, one who's making path-breaking interventions in our current scholarly and academic debates. So again, can we please a round of applause for Themi?
Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here to honour this occasion, Themi. So we're going to do a Q&A format where I'll ask Themi a few questions about the book and how he came to write and so on. Then we'll open to the floor for questions from the audience, and then we'll pass it back to Themi for the last word. So, Themi, can you first of all tell us a bit about how you came to write this book? What inspired you to undertake this study of genocide recognition? I mean, there have been a lot of studies done. It's a big field. Regrettably, it's a big field, genocide studies, and continues to be a big field. So I'm interested in, how you came to tackle this topic, because here in Australia, there are very few studies about genocide recognition in Australian scholarship. So over to you, Themi.
Thank you, Joy. So initially, my interest in the topic started through my personal connection and hearing stories growing up within my family, within my dad's barbershop, within the local community, local Greek community in particular, in Brunswick, and how those stories were shared, what was left untold or unsaid. Often silence was a factor that I noticed when it related to particular histories or particular stories. So on my paternal side, we had the stories of my grandfather fighting in the Second World War and the trauma he experienced during the Second World War. But on my mother's side, who was inspiration for this topic, I must say, is that she always spoke about the experiences of her parents, my papu, who were born in Asia Minor and left as children to Gallipoli. And she would tell me whatever she knew, shared whatever she knew of the traumatic histories and memories of their experiences. So that initially sparked my interest, but also been interested in the topic of genocide. So I heard a lot about the Armenian Genocide, read a lot about the Armenian Genocide, the Holocaust, as well as the dispossession and violence and displacement of Indigenous Australians. So that was another factor that sparked my interest. And also the recognition efforts of Armenians, which have been going on for several decades. But really the reason why I also looked at the Greeks and Assyrians is that they were often overlooked within the academic discourse. Politically, we didn't hear much about the Greeks and Assyrians in terms of the recognition efforts, and the narratives were not really shared, and often I noticed that they remained within families. So these factors, and then the cooperation between Armenians, Greeks and Assyrians within Australia, which is a unique setting for those efforts, really drove me to undertake studies in history. Initially, I did an honours degree in philosophy, and then that changed very quickly for me once it sparked my interest
Well,
again.
I think once we met, Themi, I put you on the right path, right?
I agree, definitely.
Sorry, apologies for philosophers in the audience, but clearly Themi's interest was historical. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember having those long discussions about the history side of things, because yes, you came to me as a philosopher, and we turned you into a historian.
Yep.
Which is a very fine thing.
That's right.
So one of the key arguments, Themi, in the book is that you explore how memories of mass violence are transmitted across the generations in the three communities you study, and intergenerational trauma is also a big field. And I think the way you weave those intergenerational aspects, in a way you've already articulated some of that in the answer to your first question. But can you sort of elaborate on this in terms of how you approached this aspect and what sort of material you drew on to develop this argument about intergenerational trauma?
Yep. So really there had not been any research on trauma and how the memories of the past are passed on from one generation to the next when it comes to the Assyrians and Greeks. Greeks, that is from Asia Minor, including Pontus and Eastern Thrace. So for me, I had to really think about my approach, and I looked at undertaking interviews with descendants of survivors within Australia to see how those memories are carried within families, the silence within families. There were semi-structured interviews. So basically there were a set of questions that then allowed me to ask follow-up questions where I could identify particular patterns and particular themes. And that I saw a lot of commonalities between the Greeks and Assyrians in terms of memories remaining within families and silence. So there were often expressions of grief where the descendants of survivors would notice something was wrong, wouldn't be able to put the finger onto what it was and understand or comprehend the trauma that was experienced, but it took them a while to ask questions to try and discover this history. Silence didn't mean there was complete absence of narrative, it was just that there were fragments, there was a lack of narrative, there was something missing, but there were always hints there. And I think with intergenerational trauma, with regard to the Greeks and Assyrians in particular, the way those have played out as well is through the suppression of traumatic memories due to other traumas. So with the Greeks, there's often traumas from the Second World War, the Greek Civil War. With the Assyrians, there's traumas from the Semeli massacre of 1933 in Iraq, genocide in Iraq and Syria in 2014 and 2017. And there's statelessness, the continued statelessness as well. So I think that was a major theme that I noticed, that these stories often remain within families. So the cooperation became interesting as a result of that.
How did you find your interviewees, Themi?
I think they were anonymous, and the reason why my interviews were anonymous is that they can be comfortable. It was a politically sensitive topic as well. People were not comfortable because of the nature of the topic to share those stories. The interviewers often expressed a burden of responsibility to come to terms with this history. They carried the weight of this history. They had to come to terms with it and make sense of it. So I think that was a major thing that I identified across my interviewees. And over 70 interviews were conducted, so that was quite a bit of...
a lot of talking.
Yeah, definitely, but a lot of interesting perspectives, insights on the cooperation, but also how these stories appeared within families generations later and in the diaspora in Australia.
Absolutely, that's right. So, following on from that, Themi, I think one of the great achievements in the book is that, obviously, the comparative history element, right, that you draw between Armenian, Greek and Assyrian communities. Can you say a bit more here about why you chose that comparative approach? And you also frame the book around coalition building. Just if I could draw you out a little bit about that collaboration between the three communities, so why you chose a comparative and then, the coalition building.
Yeah, I think because there has been a focus on the Armenian genocide, and of course Armenians have been very active when it comes to research, advocacy. The Greeks and Assyrians haven't been as active regarding the late Ottoman Empire and the persecution during that time. But I wanted to highlight and bring to attention their experiences, their traumatic experiences, but also they experienced the persecution, the violence, displacement, dispossession across that broader period of 1914 and 1923. They shared that experience. They were the three main communities that were targeted, and often academics would look at each group individually. So for me, it made sense to look at two groups that were overlooked often, less visible, the Greeks and Assyrians that is, and also look at their efforts and how they've cooperated, because the Armenians have led the advocacy. So really it was the Assyrians and the Greeks, particularly Pontian Greeks, they've been the most active on the topic and when it comes to the recognition efforts. But what I noticed is they initiated dialogue with the Armenian community. That started in Sydney in the late 90s, early 2000s through joint conferences where they shared their experiences, their stories and their research, and that influenced cooperation in Melbourne. Now that's something that there's continual dialogue, negotiation of these memories, and the Armenians have a model and strategy for the recognition efforts that has been very successful worldwide and within Australia, but the aim was national recognition. So for me, it was interesting to see how they collaborate, create new memories, and not necessarily compete for space when it comes to the recognition efforts. And that's why there's initiatives such as the Joint Justice Initiative today, where there is that cooperation that's been formalised.
And it's a generational thing, right? It's the next generation coming up, building new coalition and identifying the value of that sort of collaborative effort.
Definitely.
Yeah.
That is definitely,
interesting.
Yeah, and there is an effort now within the Greek and Assyrian communities to educate youth and pass these stories on to the next generation. Yeah, it would be interesting to see how they engage with these stories and this history as well.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, Themi, so the history of recognition of genocide in Australia is a very mixed one, isn't it? You know, with governments, still federal, state governments still reluctant to take the step of recognition. You know, what does your research reveal? What does it tell us about why governments have got this sort of rather mixed history of recognition?
Okay, so that's a really good question. So I'll start with when it comes to the late Ottoman period and the genocidal violence that took place then, there's a reluctance from the Australian federal government to recognise these events of genocide due to the narrative shared with Turkey around the birth of the nation. That's around the Gallipoli campaign and reconciliation between two former enemies. And the basis of this reconciliation are the alleged words of reconciliation by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, who's considered to be the founding father of modern Turkey. But this come in conflict with the recognition efforts and the genocidal violence that took place the same period. At the same time, Australian humanitarians between 1915 and 1930 were highly active in responding to the plight of the survivors and refugees. Women that were humanitarians such as Jessie Webb, Edith Glanville, Joyce Nankerville-Locke. There were Anzacs such as Sir Stanley Savage that in northwest Persia witnessed Assyrians and Armenians being persecuted and helping rescue them. There's George Devine Treloar, who was the Australian League of Nations Commissioner for Refugees, who resettled refugees, Greek refugees, after the population exchange in northern Greece. There's this history. Australians responded to this history. It is an Australian issue, but these narratives are overlooked, even though the communities, the respective communities, are often commemorating these events and conducting research and trying to reintroduce this to the public domain. At the same time, Australia has its own history with genocidal violence against Indigenous Australians. So what has happened is that there are two narratives around the birth of the nation. One supports the other, and that those two narratives relate to Turkish national narratives around the birth of the nation as well. So Mustafa Kemal Ataturk being a commander in Gallipoli, viewed as overcoming internal enemies and external powers, and triumph, and that's linked to the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 until 1922. And again, that narrative around the Turkish War of Independence, or what is also known as the Turkish nationalist movement, is also often represented in these narratives. So the Australian federal government has not recognised these events as genocide as a result, and these stories are missing from the public discourse as well.
Well, I mean, they are, and let's think about what it would take for that to change, because communities, have often been behind and are behind. There's the push for recognition. So can you say something about how each of the communities that you've studied here have mobilised a grassroots response? I mean, you talked about conferences, Themi. I mean, what other things have local communities done? And do you think ultimately, are you optimistic ultimately that the recognition of these genocides will change?
Okay, great question. I'll start with the Greek case.
Yeah.
So I think with the descendants of Greek genocide survivors, the burden rests on the diaspora, because within Greece, the way these events are viewed, it's within the framework of the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 until 1922, and not the broader period of genocidal violence against those three communities from 1914 to 1923. So there's criticism and self-blame. This relates to wartime violence, the megali there, the idea of expanding Greek territory into Anatolia, Asia Minor. As well, there is criticism around the Asia Minor catastrophe of 1922. So these events often have not made it into the public discourse unless the descendants of survivors have brought them to public attention. So Pontian Greeks are the ones that initially led the efforts. It was tied to their identity and their cultural memory. It became central to their identity, and that's why it was viewed as a Pontian issue for quite a while. And then groups from Asia Minor, descendants from Asia Minor, and then Eastern Thrace started talking about these issues. But it's within Australia really, and they influence the sentiment in Australia, but it's within Australia really that it's been viewed as a collective Greek genocidal experience, as a Greek genocide, as a Greek issue as well. But that's taken time. It's taken research, negotiation, dialogue within the community. The sentiment within Greece still influences what's happening here. So really it's Pontian Greeks that have been leading the advocacy and the activism, and on occasion joined by individuals that have a connection to Asia Minor and Eastern Thrace. And these memories often have remained within families for those communities because they weren't able to revive their identity the way the Pontian Greeks did. So the Assyrian case is interesting because of other instances of genocide, their statelessness, not being politically represented as well. And the diaspora really does a lot of work around their to address their persecution, to address their statelessness, to address cultural rights, language rights, because at the end of the day, they're the most vulnerable group and they've experienced quite a few atrocities over time. But the Armenians are the ones that are the leading partner. They've led the way for the advocacy. The other groups have been able to engage with them and follow the lead of the Armenians and create new narratives as a result that are shared. And there's that collective aim to achieve recognition as a result.
You make that point about the diaspora, Themi. I mean, and the memory within Greece is different, or at least it's not as constructed in the way it is here. I mean, does that distance from Europe or from Greece provide a sort of gap, a sort of, way of distancing yourself from the actual country that generates this sort of freedom to raise questions of genocide? I mean, genocide is a big word, right? A very big word. And so when you're identifying it culturally, politically and socially, a country has to take responsibility for this genocide of citizens. So do you think there's something privileged in the diaspora? I know in America and Canada as well, where there are diasporic movements along these lines. They're much mobilised and much more strident than they ever would be in Greece.
Yeah, I think so. I think that distance does make a difference, and having people born and educated in Australia as well changes things. That distance from the politics of memory in Greece really does help, and the generational change as well. And that's why I guess that distance has allowed research to flourish, particularly in the US, on the topic as an experience shared by the three communities as well. But I think also the Australian context really does help push the three communities to achieve or to strive for recognition, because the events coincided with, in the late Ottoman Empire, coincided with the Gallipoli campaign, and Australians that were, such as Anzacs, that were eyewitness accounts, that were eyewitnesses and had eyewitness accounts, the Australian humanitarian response, and these sorts of initiatives as well.
Yeah, it gives it a different inflection, doesn't it?
Definitely.
Here, and people like you and I, being our generations that we are here, Greek Australians, I think it opens up a dialogue that might not be possible in Greece, but we could talk about that later.
Definitely.
One of the themes, I think, in your study, Themi, here, is how the past is pervasive in the present. So in what ways do you hope that your study will broaden understandings within the Australian community? We talked about Greece, but within the Australian community, the experience and memory of migrant communities that have experienced trauma. You know, we're in the midst of lots of discussion about immigration and lots of discussion about racism and so on and so forth. How does your book kind of promote broader, wider Australian community understandings about Greek community, Assyrian community, Armenian community here in Australia, and how the community engages with the wider Australian one, but the experiences that many people here in the audience and we have internalised and interpreted and experienced?
Yeah, I think what the research can do is highlight just how important these migrant stories and diaspora stories are within the Australian context, and it broadens our understanding of Australian history, incorporating these perspectives from different migrant communities or diaspora communities, and to understand that Australia's role on the international stage was much different. There is an intergenerational effect when it comes to these stories being revisited and reimagined, and shaping the three communities when it comes to their sense of being Australian, so their Australian identity. So that, I think it's important to not overlook or omit narratives within the public sphere and reshape the way we look at Australian history, where migrant narratives fit into the national story as well, and also look at Australia's own history when it comes to violence and displacement at the same time. So there are stories that are often overlooked in the public sphere or politically that can still linger and still have an effect on people. And you see that through trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the migration story is still very much tied within stereotypes and some narratives that have been in circulation for decades. And I think the book and these sorts of this sort of research unsettles those standard stock representations of the great migrant success stories, and that's fine, and we need those narratives, but it sort of identifies other complex situations that brought many migrants to this country, and they're still embedded, as you said, within family narratives, the family stories.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So, all right. So on that note, we'll thank Themi for his responses.
Thank you, Joy. Thank you.
So we're going to open up the floor to questions. So, and for a big discussion. Nick is saying we can't hear. Is that right?
No, we've got a roving mic.
Oh, got a roving mic. Yes. Okay. So, got that first question at the front. Over here.
Fantastic. Great to see your progress there, Themi. So 2 questions. One is the narrative of Australia-Turkey, and there's a potential Greek narrative, make Gallipoli Greek, the graves that everyone talks about, the Turks looking after were put there when Greece administered the area 1919 to 22. And the Commonwealth War Commission, Graves Commission, relocated from Thessaloniki to there. So I think there's some storytelling there. But the second question is really around, I really get upset around all the social media posts. We've got the same people that are allies of this story in our community are also on social media, anti-immigrant, not recognition of the Indigenous issues. And it's sort of this gap of how do we bring together what's a genuine story, take it away from nationalism and make it a human equality story and a justice story.
Thank Thank you. Thanks for the question.
That's a great question. I think looking at this through the lens of trauma, which my book does, is very important. So once people read and understand how intergenerational trauma works, they'll be able to also understand why today particular communities seek recognition, seek truth-telling, and why they're still traumatised by events of the past. So I hope that brings a different take or perspective to these historical events as well. But this goes down to dialogue and education, and it's something that there needs to be an open forum for that, and it needs to be an ongoing conversation, and it does relate to education and understanding how trauma works, how recognition works at the same time. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Got one here in the front. I've got one over there.
There's a couple of points. Our family's from Smyrna, Garavuna, just outside of Smyrna, and so we have a very, very good knowledge of the times and how our family actually were lucky enough to escape. One point is that Brisbane has an Asia Minor Historical Society. Our cousins are members, and Connor Roney, who wrote Flames on the Water, Tears in the Sea, is also a prominent member. So they're a very active group. The other thing is I have Armenian friends, and something that I've always noticed with the Armenians is that they wanted ownership of the genocide. They were very, very reluctant to talk about, you know, the Greek genocide. And do you have any thoughts? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay. Yep. Thank you for your question. Okay, so the Armenians, I think this is the central trauma to the Armenians. They've been advocating for recognition since the 1960s. That they've been leading the lobbying internationally and been able to gain recognition as a result. So I do think that they have been open through my research and my observations to the Greeks and Assyrians collaborating and cooperating. We've seen it in Australia through 3 state-level recognitions in South Australia, New South Wales and Tasmania. Now, they are the leading partner because they've been advocating for recognition for a long time, whereas the Greeks and Assyrians started advocating in the 80s and 90s, so they're a generation ahead. And I think that the Greek and Assyrian communities have had to engage with that model or template that the Armenians had when it comes to annual commemorations, when it comes to producing research, when it comes to lobbying and their strategies for lobbying as well. So there has been that level of cooperation. It's not perfect from what I've... cooperation is never perfect. It's always uneven. That's the case. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they're competing or they want ownership. I think the Armenians have been open to incorporating the Greeks and Assyrians within their narratives, and they've been able to create new memories together. They're able to create new narratives and been able to advocate together for recognition of all 3 genocides. And that's what we've seen in Australia. And I think in Australia in particular, that's been successful.
I tend to see Australia, when we take into consideration 99% of our population is a multicultural immigrant population. We are predominantly a nation of immigrants. Therefore, I tend to see the stories of all of our communities are the stories of Australia. It is our maker, and they should be incorporated in the Australian narrative as far as history goes. And the secret to that must surely be the promotion of education. It's only with education, educating our own community and the broader community at large, that we will all be able to embrace the historical value of all of our communities, for we all together make up the narrative of who is an Australian and what is an Australian, and that should be embraced and not undermined.
Thank you. No.
I take it that's more a comment than a question. So.
Anyone else got any questions or comments? But there's a few other, yeah, there's quite a few now, so that's okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation tonight. In the course of your investigation, did you find out how the theory or concept of eugenics and ethnic cleansing was developed in some German universities, and how the young Turks who want to study there were influenced by this kind of ideas?
From my research, what I've seen in the scholarship on the matter is that the main influence, I mean, eugenics, not sure whether there were. Okay, so basically, these groups were viewed as internal enemies. They were viewed as weeds to be uprooted. That's what they were described as. So at that stage, we wouldn't talk about eugenics, but we talk about these communities being viewed by the young Turks and then the Turkish nationalist movement as internal enemies that had to be eliminated and removed for the young Turks to maintain a crumbling empire, and for then the Turkish nationalist movement to be able to establish a modern Turkish nation state, and that was to exclude them. They didn't fit into that model. They couldn't be assimilated, they couldn't be integrated in any way. They were viewed as other, as different, as an internal enemy that collaborated with the foreign powers. That's the main, that's the core of the reason as to why they were persecuted. And that's why there was a genocidal process. And ideologically, that developed across 2 phases, but even in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we see that movement because there were attempts for reformation, attempts at self-determination within the Ottoman Empire as well. So, yeah, thank you for your question.
Congratulations, Themi, and Joy as well.
Thank you.
It's a great book. Do you think the Gallipoli campaign had any influence on the initiation of the genocide, or perpetuation of the genocide, because they were Christian and being invaded by Christian countries? Do you think that had any influence?
There are multiple factors. Thank you for your question, firstly. Sorry, I'm jumping. There are multiple factors. One of the factors was, the groups being viewed as potentially collaborating with the great powers and those powers that were going to invade the Ottoman Empire. That's why we see 2 weeks prior to the Gallipoli landing, the Anzac landing in Gallipoli, that over 30,000 Greeks from Gallipoli were uprooted, they were deported. And that's something that's often overlooked. It's only been revisited in terms of history now. And some news reports indicated that was one of it was under the pretext of, obviously they wanted to get rid of them, but it was an excuse to get rid of them, from my understanding, on the basis of viewing them as internal enemies and being suspicious of them collaborating. So that goes across the 3 groups in many different ways across the First World War and even the Greco-Turkish War. And even the most loyal citizens, we should also remember, were persecuted in the end, including people that served in the armies of the Young Turks and the Kemalists.
Just curious about your, interview process as well. How do you kind of come up with the right questions to ask, but also navigate people's intergenerational trauma, especially where silence has been such a prominent response? How do you get people to talk about something that's been so traumatic for so long?
Thank you for your question. It's a good question. So I had a set list of questions, and I was able to probe and ask follow-up questions depending on the reactions I got or what kind of information was shared. So overall, you did get moments where there were expressions of anger, being upset, a bit of distress. You'd had to sort of navigate that and control the interview. So you'd had to also navigate what type of questions you would be asking. So the great thing about semi-structured interviews for me was that I was able to ask those follow-up questions or avoid asking further questions when necessary. But also having interviews be anonymous, I think, was good in the sense that it allowed them to speak freely about not only their experiences, but how they view these events and their own insights. Thank you.
I would like to, I don't have a question. Themi, congratulations.
Thank you,
on the
John.
book.
Thank you.
I would like to respond to the previous question if it was the Gallipoli factor. Not at all, because the genocide was started more than a year before that. It happened that the World War I, Gallipoli coinciding similar time, and that's what Turkish government's trying to make excuse. Oh, it was war, and because of the war, that everybody had losses, etc.
Yeah, no, sorry, that's a good point. I should clarify. What I was trying to say, that there were multiple reasons across that period why there were deportations or violence, but the genocidal process, John's correct, did start in 1914 against the Greeks of Eastern Thrace, then across the west coast of Anatolia, and against the Assyrians as well. And then that progressed, and there were further deportations and acts of violence. So thank you. I should have probably clarified that prior to that.
Hey, Themi, congratulations on your first book.
Thank you.
Well done. Just a quick question on my end. I think mine specifically pertains to the population exchange of the 1920s and how much Greece's internal, opinion about the Greeks coming from Asia Minor, how much that has influenced the recognition of genocide.
Yeah. So initially, the Greeks from Asia Minor and Eastern Thrace, once they settled in Greece, were viewed as different, as other. They weren't viewed as pure Greek in a lot of cases. That type of discrimination that existed, and I think really it took a few generations to try and revisit this history and make an effort to make Asia Minor culture part of the mainstream Greek culture, national stories as well. So obviously the 2 days of national days of remembrance within Greece, recognised by the Hellenic Parliament in 94 and 98, one for Pontus, one from Asia Minor. But really those descendants have had to try and fit into a modern or a developing Greek state with a developing identity, and eventually were integrated. But they're the ones really that have been leading the efforts, the attempts to remember the past, and it's not something that comes from the Greek state, that's for sure. It's the other way around. So that's why it's something to highlight, is that this is not just an expression of nationalism or anything like that. This is an expression of trauma very often, and intergenerational trauma. Thank you.
Hi, Themi. Just in your research of the past, was the fact of religion put in silence, per se? And second question is, in your present research here with your book, did you find any hurdles or any efforts to question your line of your book?
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, it had to come with, considering my background as well and the position I come from, which I acknowledge in my book, a lot of scholarly distance as much as possible. So it took a lot of training, and I think over time I was able to see, things based on the themes I identified, and broader themes and issues I may have seen, or patterns of commonalities when it comes to trauma, commemoration, collaboration, etc. So I don't know if I questioned it. I mean, it was constantly developing, but Joy obviously was great helping me the whole time navigate that, because it was a very complicated topic initially. I remember when I approached you, it was just, it was a bit of a mess, I think.
As a philosopher, we turned him into a historian.
Exactly.
I mean, look, I think in a topic like this, you traverse so many elements. It's a big enough project to do one of these communities. To do 3, it's very ambitious. So credit to Themi for taking it on, because, as I was saying earlier, I mean, its contribution and originality lies in this capacity to bring together the sort of bodies of knowledge around 3 communities, which is really quite a feat, right? So I think you did that, you've done that extremely well,
Thank you.
Demi, and
Thanks.
that's been really difficult. Because they all have their own dynamics, their own history, their own complexity. I mean, these are really complex stories. So to distill that and bring them together, I think there's been great achievement for Themi. Just in terms of your other question about the line of argument, I mean, it's an interesting one because, you always come up against a counter-narrative, and it's what you do as a historian with that counter-narrative. And I guess in the discipline, you take it on, right? You say, well, this is the position of others, and this is the position others have put in terms of the scholarship. My line of inquiry is this, and then you've just got to see it right through, and I think Themi does a great job of that.
Thank you.
And Themi, you know what it's like. I mean, people, and I've done it, we've all done interviews, and people do challenge you, right? They say, well, I don't know about that, or I don't agree with that, or you're steering me in another direction that I want to go in. And I think Themi's great skill is to navigate that. It's always difficult to navigate people's personal stories if they're not of your own family, frankly. But I think you've done a great job of that, Themi, and the threads throughout that are sustained throughout the book. It's a wonderful achievement. So,
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Themi, an experience I've had in interviewing, and this is more Civil War trauma rather than genocide trauma, is that, let's say the father would not really open up to his children because they didn't really understand the narrative or knew how to ask the right question. Yeah. But when I came to the picture, they respected the fact that I did my research, I knew the background, they felt confident with me, that I knew what I was talking about, and I just let it hang out. So did you have that experience, like respecting you for the fact that, you've done the groundwork and you're asking sort of pertinent questions and they had greater confidence in answering?
I think so. That's a great point. I think so. I noticed a few times, it was the first time the interviewers shared those stories, completely shared those stories or even shared them at all, and that was with me. So they had complete trust, I think, in the interview process, and I had great respect for the interviewees as well, and being careful about how I navigate those questions and what type of questions I asked.
Thank you.
I think, can I just pick up on that, Nick, briefly, because, I mean, we do have an advantage, right? I mean, going into these interviews, as you say, Nick, I mean, it's part of our family histories, it's part of where we've come from, it's part of who we are, and we go to an interviewee and we share that together.
You don't want to be too disconnected as well. So.
No, I mean, I think that gives you an in, right?
I think so.
And it creates a dialogue that, is incredibly productive. And I think that's why we all of us here collectively should continue this work, right? Because it is our community, and I think we're the ones to do it.
Yeah. I saw some hands at the back.
Hi there. I just want to say congratulations to the both of you.
Thank you.
I'm just starting my honours year at Melbourne University looking at Greek identity. Congratulations on this book, it's really important, and also Joy, you've been a huge inspiration with some of your works, so thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Something that I've been coming up constantly when I've been, interviewing my family about sort of their experience as children of Pontians specifically, and something that I think is often overlooked in this kind of area is, and it was kind of mentioned before, but the Greek state's kind of attempt at kind of erasing cultural pluralism within Greece and kind of not helping to there's no Pontian language recognition in Greece, there's no efforts to keep it alive, kind of wanted to blend the Asia Minor Greeks into the kind of nationalistic narrative of what the Greek state was and what the Greeks were. I wanted to know if that was something that was kind of similar in the Armenian and Assyrian communities, and whether you think this is something that the Greek state will have to reckon with eventually, sort of their lack of acknowledgement of these communities and their pluralism.
Okay, that's a good question. It's a complex one to answer. Okay, so I think, yes, the history or the culture of Asia Minor Greeks, of Eastern Thracian Greeks, of Pontian Greeks, that's been sort of integrated as much as possible within mainstream Greek culture, within music, for example. But yes, dialect-wise, Pontian dialect or other dialects have been sort of phased out. And it goes back to when the refugees from Asia Minor and including Pontus and Eastern Thrace, went to Greece. That they spoke different dialects. Pontians more so had a stronger dialect that stood out, and they were often discriminated against because of that. And that's a history I don't think it's been really reconciled with within Greece, or just generally speaking. There were interviewees that mentioned, their parents being whipped with a cane for speaking the Pontian dialect at school. So there were those attempts to phase the language out to integrate or assimilate these different Greek groups. At the end of the day, I've had the interviewees still feel very strong about their Greek identity, I must say, but also about coming from Pontus or a particular part of Asia Minor or a particular part of Eastern Thrace. But that's something that I think, there'll be more that will have to be tied into this broad issue around commemoration and also recognition, political recognition. That is.
Can I just add, for many decades, the Pontians were the other to many Greeks. It took quite a few decades for them to be accepted. I recall reading one interview where the Pontian interviewer said, "The first time I really felt I was Greek was when the Albanians arrived." So that's how long the assimilation process took. So.
Yeah.
Given that you're a mixed background in the sense that you have a refugee background on one side and let's say non-refugee on the other, what is the attitude of the non-refugee Greeks here towards this genocide matter? Do they care about it, or do you have any feeling about that?
I think, thanks for your question. I should thank people before I answer the question, but I think that there is more research now, more awareness about what happened. Initially, no one really, connected with it, were affected by it. But over time, understanding history, what happened, the trauma experienced, survival across generations, these memories have still lingered. I think that's really reshaped how, particularly in the Greek diaspora, these events have been remembered. I think the wider Greek community is starting to engage more. Those that don't have a connection to the events are starting to engage more with this history. And that's because research is growing. There are more discussions around, there's more commemoration, there's active efforts to recognise these events as genocide. Thank you.
I'll probably take two more questions. Simona?
I think it's absolutely wonderful that a book like this has come out of Melbourne. My question is, do you intend to continue studying this topic?
I don't think I can stop. I think there's always further research. I mean, there's so many different themes and so much material that's left over that I need to investigate and look at and research, yeah. So I think it will continue in different forms, though. Definitely, thank you.
Final question at the back here.
Thank you, Themi. Congratulations once again. And a quick question I have for you is, why was it that the Greeks of Pontian origin became more active than the rest of the Greeks of Asia Minor in recognising and commemorating the genocide?
Thanks, Mary. That's a great question. The Greeks from other regions of Asia Minor and from Eastern Thrace often integrated into identities of where they resettled. And for Pontian Greeks, they were able in the 80s to revive their identity. And that was inherently tied to the genocide in the late Ottoman Empire as well. They were active as a result of that. It became part of a central part of their memories. There were also Pontic Greeks that were uprooted from the Soviet Union. They were geographically isolated. Their dialects stood out more. There's many factors as to why that was the case. Another case may also be the reason why it's only now with research that we talk about this as a Greek genocide, and is that for a long time this topic was viewed within the framework of the Greco-Turkish War. Pontus been more so isolated from the wartime violence, and that's why that influenced their advocacy. But obviously with research now, this is changing. With intercommunal cooperation, this is changing, and we see more Greeks from Asia Minor and Eastern Thracian background talking about this, because those memories within those families, they were traumatised as well. It's just that it never made it to the public sphere. It just stayed within families, and they had to try and make sense of it without an organised or coordinated effort, because they didn't have that sort of revival of identity or support or movement more so.
So thanks everyone for the questions. That was a fantastic discussion, and I think, Themi, you'd like to thank a few people and say a few words. So.
Am I able to go to the podium if that's all right?
You want to go to the
I have a long list of thank yous, that's why.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Joy. Yeah, appreciate it.
Go ahead. Oh yes, there's a list. There it is.
Should I just... Okay, I'll try not to take too long. So first, I would like to thank Dr. Nick Dulles and the Greek community of Melbourne and Victoria for organising the event and for hosting the seminar series. It's an excellent series, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to launch the book here tonight. I would like to thank Mary Tsaganis for sponsoring this event in memory of her mother Olympia and her ancestors from Asia Minor. I would, of course, like to thank Professor Joy Demusi. Joy has been my PhD supervisor and supported me and supported this work for many years. I'm deeply grateful for her guidance, encouragement, advice, and insights throughout the PhD and the development of this book, including writing the foreword. And thank you for also agreeing to launch the book tonight.
My pleasure.
I would like to also thank my brother, Dr. Evangelos Kritikakos, where is he? There, who has been a mentor to me throughout my academic journey and life. Your encouragement, constant feedback, advice and support have meant a great deal, and I'm grateful. I would like to also acknowledge all of the interview participants from the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian communities who contributed to this research. Many generously shared family stories and memories that had often remained private for generations. I'm deeply grateful for the trust they placed in me. Without their willingness to share their experiences and reflections, this research would not have been possible. I would like to thank my partner Nikki for her support throughout this journey, my parents, my mother Vasilia, my father Christo, and my sister Michelle for their constant encouragement and support throughout my life and throughout my education. I'm incredibly grateful. I would also like to acknowledge my godson and nephew Byron. He's not here today because he's sick, but he represents the younger generation that will continue to engage with these histories, and he represents the future. I would also like to thank my sister-in-law Joanne, my friends, my extended family, and all those who've supported the research over the years and shown an interest in my work. And there are just many members of the Armenian, Greek and Assyrian communities who are here tonight that I would like to acknowledge, and your presence means a great deal. So thank you for being here, and thank you all for being here tonight, and I truly appreciate it. And I just want to say some words in Greek, if that's okay. Θα ήθελα επίσης να πω λίγα λόγια στα ελληνικά. Σας ευχαριστώ όλους για την παρουσία σας απόψε. Η παρουσία σας δείχνει ότι υπάρχει πραγματικό ενδιαφέρον για την ιστορία και τη μνήμη των γενοκτονιών που επηρέασαν τόσες οικογένειες και κοινότητες. Το βιβλίο βασίστηκε σε μεγάλο βαθμό στις μαρτυρίες ανθρώπων από τις αρμένικες, ελληνικές και ασσυριακές κοινότητες, οι οποίοι μοιράστηκαν οικογενειακές ιστορίες και μνήμες που μεταδόθηκαν από γενιά σε γενιά. Σε πολλές περιπτώσεις όμως αυτές οι μνήμες δεν είχαν εκφραστεί για πολλά χρόνια λόγω του τραυμάτος που βίωσαν οι επιζώντες. Είναι σημαντικό αυτές οι ιστορίες να καταγράφονται και να μελετώνται, ώστε να κατανοούμε καλύτερα όχι μόνο το παρελθόν, αλλά και το πώς η μνήμη και το τραύμα συνεχίζουν να επηρεάζουν τις κοινότητες μέχρι σήμερα. Σας ευχαριστώ.
declare the meeting closed and hope to see you all on Thursday.